Welcome to Cover Book Beat. Last year, we had the extraordinary opportunity to interview our guest on the publication of his book, Agenda 2060, The Future as It Happens, which explores the consequences of political correctness becoming political policy and in turn becoming political totalitarianism. It was a wild ride that drew a great deal of critical acclaim, and now the author, who goes by the pen name AI Fabler, is back with a sequel that is, if anything, both more fun and even more intellectually stimulating. Book 2 of Agenda 2060 is subtitled AI and the View from Space. Mr. Fabler's storied background has given him a unique perspective that has taken him from his home in New Zealand to journalism in Australia to his own ad agency in London and Paris, to production of world-class Syrah wine, to show-running $2 billion property IPOs. And all the time, he's been writing plays, novellas, and award-winning screenplays. He says he decided to take himself seriously in 2013, get down to the business of writing full-time, and the reading public is so glad he made that decision. We're very pleased to welcome back Artie Fabler. Welcome.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways authors have been able to comment on present societal foibles has been to set the story in the future, extrapolating what happens if this goes on. But many of the previous efforts were undeniably grim, such as 1984, Animal Farm. Your work, what does have its grim details, is more of a Jonathan Swift, a Rabelaisian satirical vibe to it. I get a picture of you sitting at the keyboard every so often just chuckling. Oh, and you can nail a particularly pungent bit of the satire.
Well, that was certainly true with book one, which I think you would have to acknowledge was a satirical romp. And there were so many targets that it was very easy to write. It's less true about book two, where I focused on technology, today's technology, and where it may lead us in 40 years' time. And in that respect, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a technologist, I had to do a lot of reading, but I also had to do a lot of prediction, say supposition, and make sure that it at least was plausible for the reader. So in that respect, it's less overtly humorous, I guess. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, I hope it makes people think.
Oh, seriously. I wanted to ask you this. If you see yourself as a modern Socrates, a gadfly stinging the Athenians out of their lethargy?
Well, if Socrates had an enormous amount of reference sources that he could cite, yes, I might be a bit of a Socrates, but he didn't have the enormous references that we now have. And it's so easy when you're writing, Roger. So you sit down, you start a sentence, and you think you know where that's going to go, but by the end of the sentence, it's already leading you into a much broader examination of the vague idea that you had in mind. And what you can do nowadays, of course, is you just go off and click on Google, or as it happens these days, ChatGPT, and you can be filled in with information that you didn't otherwise have when you started the sentence. So you can imagine it's not so much going down a rabbit hole as launching yourself into a space of new knowledge, which is quite stimulating for the writer. Well, and hopefully that comes through for the reader.
Oh, I would say absolutely. One of the things I like about your work is I like people that send me to the dictionary for new words, and you're very good at that. Sapiosexuality, a person sexually attracted to highly intelligent people. I didn't know I was one, but I am. And then the other one, the demisexual, not half sexual, meaning desire to share a sexual experience with someone relied on first having achieved an emotional bond. I didn't know I was one of those either. And then my absolute favorite, you introduced me to a new verb, epiphing, as in having an epiphany. You get huge bonus points for that. Have you always
I wonder if there is such a word.
There is now. It's in use. Have you always been interested in wordplay as a side note to this?
I guess from a journalist background and a copywriter's background, you'd have to say yes. Mm-hmm. Because if you find a word, even if people are not using it in their day-to-day vocabulary, but nevertheless it suggests its own meaning, then it wakes people up. It enlivens a sentence. And so I've always tried to have a fairly rich vocabulary. I have to say that there is another thing, and that is with age. What I've found is that uh, because my learning, and particularly my learning in terms of written expression, occurred prominently in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, I have a vocabulary that some people have forgotten. And so if I slip it into my writing, you go, oh, hang on, I think I recognize that word, but I better look it up and make sure I know what it means.
Well, obviously, you've done your research because it's thoroughly delightful. And really, I will say this one made me think more about certain aspects of what happens if this goes on. Again, the only two universal laws are gravity and unintended consequences. And you explore that wonderfully.
What about taxes?
Well, that's not so much a law as a happenstance, but it's in there. I suppose it's a trio there. It's just like Einstein, as opposed to said, the two most common elements in the universe are hydrogen and stupidity. So apparently that works as well. I, you know, it's always difficult when you're talking about, you don't want to give away the whole plot, but you want to give the listeners enough of a grasp of it. How would you describe this part of the ongoing saga that I suspect this is going to be?
Well, I think if you have any memory of the first book, or even if you don't know about the first book, but you read in the prelude to the second book what it was about, it was essentially saying that society is heading towards a lot of what the progressives, the social justice warriors, actually want in the world, and that many of their desired outcomes are actually desired by ordinary people as well, not necessarily the way in which they promote them, but we all want a clean planet, and we don't want to victimize people. And what I said about those in the first book was that we should be very careful about what we wish for because of the unintended consequences. And I made fun of a number of things like victimhood. Now, I've said that. So, okay, that's my statement. Now what? Well, here we are looking 40 years hence, and I call this predictive fiction rather than science fiction. And I say, what are the technological trends happening currently, which we can presume will be very much progressed 40 years from now? And obviously, AI is a prominent one, as is space exploration and technology. And the other one is the control of society's thoughts and speech. And so those are the three themes that I decided to focus on. And although some of the vehicles that I've used in the book seem pretty wild in terms of speculating about where technology will lead us, they are all currently under investigation. They're all being taken seriously, and feasibility studies are being undertaken for them, including the opening page, which is where the um, one of the principal protagonists, a guy called Elon Toffler, who is loosely based on you-know-who, Elon Musk, is visiting as a space station launch platform, which is actually based at the 62-mile level of lower space. And he's saying, what a great idea this was. I never thought it would happen. Well, when I first encountered the concept, I thought this is a great idea, but I never thought it would happen. But it's actually being advanced by a Japanese technology company, and it could feasibly happen. So this is the sort of approach that I took to technology throughout. As far as AI is concerned, I have to say that the tipping point in AI has occurred during the writing of this book. not thanks to me, but thanks to generative AI development. And now everybody, of course, is saying, oh, AI, what are we going to do about it? And on the one hand, some people are saying this is absolutely fantastic. Think of all the possibilities that it can spawn. And on the other hand, people are saying this is the doomsday event that we predicted, and the world, needs to be saved from it. Well, I don't fall into really either of those categories, because my view of AI is that actually it's it's developed by mankind. It doesn't have its own gestation sources other than through the mind of mankind. So what we have to be talking about here is how can we trust mankind, not how can we trust AI.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very big feature of my thinking in the book.
It is indeed. And one of the things you mentioned is that computers, and I quote you, have no bad habits or intentions. Those need to be learned from their prompt engineers. Garbage in, garbage out, good stuff in, good stuff out, or maybe some mixture of that.
Well, exactly. ChatGPT's founders, OpenAI, have openly admitted that the data scraping that they're doing is predominantly left-wing woke, because that's the view of the world that they have, and that's the view of the world that they want to subject people to when they go researching for information.
Mm-hmm.
They don't deny it.
No, and I think you've done a masterful job of extrapolating what will happen or could very possibly happen if this goes on. Um, oh gosh, there's so many. As I mentioned before, I take notes when I read the book. 18 pages solid notes from this one. And so if I'm bouncing around a little bit, you'll know that's why I haven't organized my notes as well as I might have. But I want to comment on a couple of things. One is you have at least some science fiction cred, because you cite the best science fiction book a great number of years ago, and that's Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, with his magnificently named hero protagonist. What better name for the lead character?
Yeah. The thing I like about Ferguson is that he has a really great sense of humor. And so while you become engrossed in the story, which is a fanciful story for most of us, because it's in the metaverse where anything can be made to happen, he nevertheless reminds you that he's a human being writing about it, and he has this great sense of humor. And that links you into the story extremely well. And so I make no excuse for the fact that I try to keep humor in my writing of the future, just in order to ground people in the fact that, hey, you're a human being, and this is a place that you could conceivably find yourself in 40 years.
Yeah.
The best way of reminding yourself you're a human being is to have a chuckle.
One of the things right at the very beginning of the book, you kind of signal that a little bit when you talk about the story about the man and the dog in this facility and what their respective jobs are.
Yeah, it's not my story. I've heard it before. But basically, so what it says is that that there's a man in a factory somewhere who's supposed to be minding the data center, which really means monitoring the temperature, if nothing else. And there's a dog, and the dog's job is to stop the man from doing anything. Now, I've expressed that slightly differently in the book, where I think I'm trying to remember who I stole it from, but I'd read it somewhere, and it makes sense.
But the man's job is to feed the dog, and the dog's job is to keep the man from touching anything or messing anything up.
Exactly.
And that's kind of the vibe that sets it off for me for the whole book about that. And you mentioned obviously that some of your characters are what they call thinly disguised, perhaps representations of people in the real world. And some of those people, are they going to be around 40 years from now, do you think?
Well, the people who I represent, basically through pastiches, are Elon Musk, who is one of the most interesting people currently in the world of technology. Bill Gates, about whom people have very different but quite strongly held opinions, and George Soros. Now, the latter two have appeared in Agenda 2060, Book 1. Bill Gates has the name Will Portico in this book, which is pretty obvious, isn't it? It's Bill and it's a gate. And I started out being extraordinarily skeptical about Bill Gates for very good reasons, I think, as many people are very skeptical about him. But once I decided to give him a human character, that is an emotional character, I started to feel sorry for him. I started to actually empathize with him. And so through the book, not by any pre-design, but just by the way that I had decided to get inside his soul and the things that he believed in, which he maybe believed in falsely, that he was a human character. And by the end of the book, I actually quite liked him. In the case of George Soros, well, George Soros is a very manipulative person. His foundations are disguised with many different names, and they're giving money to a lot of action groups that are dubious, let's say, in their intent. I think he's handed over some of the responsibilities for those foundations to his son now. But he seems to have been around for 150 years anyway. And as you know, if you read the book, life extension is part of what technology is capable of delivering in 40 years' time. And so I didn't think that there was anything at all odd in suggesting that Soros and Gates and Elon Musk would still be alive in 40 years. In fact, they might be alive in 100 years, God forbid.
Well, and if life extension is possible, it will be possible for the rich first. So that they have the capability to take advantage of that.
A bit like in vitro fertilization for those who believe that men can have babies.
Amazing. One of the things I wanted that really kind of hit me was your talk about the society's take on disabilities, which really made me rethink all of the things that I was thinking about that, and how the woke people believe in supporting all those with disabilities, but maybe that's not the best thing to do, because that means that you're implying that they're below the norm, which is non-disabled, and therefore you shouldn't help them because you are discriminating against them for being against the norm. It's an unusual aspect of thinking about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you take the whole victimization agenda that is prevalent in progressive discourse currently, you'd have to say it is fairly insulting to every group that is been identified as being victims. I mean, like if I was a Black African, I would not want to be treated in such a condescending manner as they are currently treated by the anti-racists, which is to say that that they shouldn't achieve educational standards that other people can achieve, but nevertheless be granted entry into colleges and such like. I mean, I'd say, back off. What are you saying to me? That I'm not good enough?
Mhm.
I think what you're referring to in the book here is that I was making the point that in a challenging world, which is going into space is, that there's no point in overlooking the fact that being fat can actually be an impediment to your performance, and you really wouldn't gain entry into the space capsule if you were bordering on obese and suffered the health problems that brings with it. So why not face the truth? Why not say, try and avoid being fat because it's not healthy. If you are fat and you're having great difficulty, what we will give is understanding and sympathy, but we won't encourage you to go into denial. So, does that sound unreasonable?
Yeah, it's I found it fascinating that you kind of use space itself as kind of a stand-in for reality, making it a reality check. And you say, I'm going to quote you from here. It says, once you start applying the theories to the environment of space, reality makes nonsense of them. There's no way of providing wheelchair access on a space station or gender-specific toilets for multiple self-identifying transgenders or access to critical spaceship controls for the deaf or the blind or people who are subject to psychotic fits, which makes perfect sense in retrospect. But if you never think through to that step, you don't get that revelation.
Exactly. Well, I think the very concept of going into space, and particularly colonizing another planet in space, really begins a new era of evolution for the human beings that undertake it. You have to start virtually from fresh, and evolution, as we know, is all about survival. So it's going back to basics.
It is indeed, and it's just amazing how much this book is going to make you think. I'm speaking to those who are listening now about all sorts of things. But in spite of that, this is not a dystopia. This is ends in hope.
Yeah. Well, I took a deep breath and did a very risky thing, Roger, particularly in the current climate. And that is, I returned to the concept of faith. And we're not talking about religion here, it's faith. And I said that human beings actually can't survive without it. It's like if you took away the hunger need, the desire for food in human beings, so that they didn't eat, they would die. And if you take away from human beings the desire to know where they stand in the universe and whether or not they have an identity and what the purpose of their living is, then essentially you're taking away from them the human desire to have faith in their own being. Now, where this comes in the book is that the principal characters are faced with trying to understand infinity. And the more well, of course, once you start appearing into space, the more you have to think about infinity, about was there a beginning? Is there an end? Or is this eternal? Does it go on and on and on? Now, once you start looking at that as a subject, then you really are using science to help you in the pursuit of your own faith in living. And I think a lot of that faith in living, faith in humanity and what it is, has been lost, but it hasn't necessarily been lost within the individual. And so I took this very risky course within the book of leading the main protagonist to come to the conclusion that it is them and their belief in humanity and their belief in the concept of individuals having a soul that would be ultimately the answer to any of the threats that technology might throw up. And you have to wait towards the end of the book for this to be realized, but that's where readers are really coming back to me in force and saying how much they like it. They've never had that element included in anything that might be described as science fiction or predictive fiction.
You know, in fact, there's a quote that you use several times in the book: truth resides in all of us if only we have the courage to find it. I think that's magnificent. And it really makes you think.
Well, it's actually the answer that I give when I encounter intolerant progressives who absolutely believe that making statements as a denial of truth will eventually make them right if enough people around them make the same statements. Instead of saying, rubbish, you know what you're saying, this is complete and utter BS. I just say, in your quiet moments, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that a person with a penis is a woman?
There's nothing you can say to that, really.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Again, I'm bouncing around some of the other quotes I wanted to mention. Is one of the things you say: men who play at being God need to be ready to fight the devil when the moment comes. And I thought that was an interesting observation as well.
Yeah. Well, actually, you occasionally get glimpses of that with Elon Musk. Gosh, he's such a contradictory character. But when he spoke out about the reason for him leaving OpenAI, which, as we know, started off as a non-profit, I thought, now this is quite a stand for a person like Elon, who essentially doesn't believe that anything is impossible technologically. He's a person who says, if it can be imagined, it can happen. Eventually, it can be made to happen. I mean, which is a wonderful thing for an entrepreneur. I have to say, I really admire him for that. Now, that's a very different approach to the world to somebody like Bill Gates, for instance, who essentially arrived on the scene and mastered software programming very early on and realized what could be done with it. And as a result, because of his timing and also because he's a very astute guy, made an absolute fortune, and then decided on the basis, oh, look, I've got this great fortune. I'm going to change the world. I'm going to change the world in every area, regardless of how much I know about that area. I'll just hire experts in that area. And some of the things that he's done, some of the things that he's embarked on currently, I think are absolutely disastrous for the world. And I'm thinking particularly of the vaccination programs and the diminution in immunity that it is bringing on in so many areas. Vaccination is not necessarily the solution to dealing with all of the illnesses that nature can throw up. And I'm not sure that he stops long enough to think about that sort of thing. Now, what else can I say?
Yeah. Well, one of the things you mentioned is that this does have a tendency to potentially reduce natural immunity you get from, well, it's like helicopter parents not letting the kids play in the dirt as we did in our childhoods, and somehow survived all of that, but that built up natural immunity. And if you get too sterile an environment, you're not going to have that.
exactly. Well, look at what's happened with seeds, for instance. Um, so they've made seeds that will grow a very vigorous first crop and not produce any fertile seeds themselves. So the farmers are left as financial victims of the seed companies that produce them, like Monsanto. Um, now, the problem is, of course, that what we have with these really good ideas is that as soon as you introduce politics and greed into it, somehow they become distorted. Isn't that the story of virtually every innovation in the last 50 years in terms of technology? And I'm speaking particularly of the internet and social media.
Which started out, we had such great hopes back in the day. I recall it well. I think the ability to look up anything and find knowledge will be a renaissance. And instead, we get TikTok videos and memes and silly things and scary things as instead of and little groups of malcontents that were isolated and letting society go on now suddenly can clump together and listen to their own echo chamber and never get exposed to any other views.
Yeah, I think that was pretty hard to predict. I mean, it started out at a time when academics had the really strange idea that knowledge was wonderful and knowledge was something they wanted to share. You remember?
Mm-hmm.
That's,
What a concept.
wow, that's fantastic. So that was very innocent and altruistic, and well, admittedly, it was initially financed by the Pentagon, so maybe that was a warning in itself. But now, of course, the question is, how come it can't be controlled? Now, I'm not talking about the abandonment of free speech, because I'm a staunch believer in free speech, particularly from people I disagree with, and because it's the only way that I can really find out who they are and what they truly think.
Mm-hmm.
But to say that governments need to get together and do something about controlling social media, look at the effect it's having on our children, you know, the suicide and depression rates and all of that sort of stuff. It's extraordinarily hollow commentary, because you know what governments do. They co-opt anything that is powerful enough for their own use, and that's what happened through COVID demonstrably. Um, and so it's going to happen with AI as well. When you hear about these people turning up in front of Congress and the members of Congress saying, "So what are we going to do about these threats? You know, about the risk of singularity when the computers or the algorithms start to develop their own ideas and their own motivations. What are we going to do about it?" And they think, well, we think that we should all get together and we should draft a convention. That sounds very like Zuckerberg and Google, and
Yeah,
you know, here we go again.
exactly. I was just trying to remember, there was one of Roger Zelazny's books. He talks about what governments do. He said, I think the quote is, better to inculcate than strive to extirpate. In other words, buy them off, bring them inside where you can control them. And I can see that potentially happening.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, they're all on the same side.
Yeah.
That's what needs to be understood. Um, you know, in the book, I make reference to, you know, the roughly 3,000 elites in the world who are essentially controlling everything. This is where I start touching upon the internet and its ability to be able to control what everybody says and what everybody thinks, and how the one world proponents will always want to seek ultimate control over it. And in the process of that, I mentioned a group that I guess you could say sounds a little bit like BlackRock. I actually call them Black Courts.
You do.
Yes. and they have the ability to pull together 3,000 of the world's leading elites, who come obviously from the digital sector, the oligarchs of technology, from finance and from the inner sanctums of government, and they're all on the same page. What they're looking for is to ultimately be able to wield a universal, not universal, but a worldwide power, because this is the logical point that you reach if you're a member of the elite and regard human beings as being the problem.
Right. And I have to interrupt you now because I'm about to run out of time in my cheap 40-minute Zoom. I want to appreciate everything you've done. I've got about 2 minutes left. Is there anything we've not touched on you want to touch on very briefly?
Well, the one thing is that the book has only been out since the 20th of November. Let me show it if I can. Can I show that? No,
Yes,
I can't show it because
we'll put it in the post-production. It'll be there.
But the awful thing is the number of readers who are writing back and saying, I can't wait for book 3, to which I go, oh dear. So
you're in it now, and we so appreciate it. I have to apologize for cutting you off. I could talk for a long time. Our guest is AI Fabler. The latest is Agenda 2060, Book 2, AI and the View from Space. Thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it.
Thank you, Roger. It's always lovely to talk to you.
All right.